with the diva of the garden, which is the macrophylla hydrangea. So macrophylla, these are big-leafed hydrangea. That's what macrophylla means. So they are big-leafed hydrangea. They are the ones that if you're looking at photos from Martha's Vineyard, or you kind of see those big coastal hydrangeas, these massive 8 and 10 foot tall hydrangeas that have 1,000 bright blue or pink or purple flowers. Those are most likely macrophylla type hydrangeas. These are for sure the most difficult to be successful with. They're actually very easy to grow, and I'll explain that in a minute, but they're very difficult to get heavy flowering on. So let's talk about these a little bit. So macrophylla hydrangeas typically, at least in the past, bloom on what is called old wood. So old wood means that you have a branch left from last year. That branch survives the winter, or at least a bud on that branch survives the winter, and that bud becomes a new branch. So that growth that happens so in this case, this is the year 2022. So we have a branch that is from 2021 or before. It has a healthy bud, and a new branch starts to form from that bud. And that growth that occurs in 2022 is considered old wood, or it's coming off of old wood. And that's where the flower buds are going to form on macrophylla hydrangeas. All macrophylla hydrangeas bloom very well from old wood. However, here in northern Illinois, in most winters, these hydrangeas will die all the way to the ground. We have harsh winters, oftentimes with very little snow cover, and so the branches dry out, or what we call desiccate. So they dry out completely, they die, but the plant itself is perfectly fine, and it comes back from it comes back from the ground, from the root system. It starts coming out of the ground. So if it comes out of the ground from the root system, that would be considered new growth, or new wood rather. So that new wood is very unlikely to produce a flower bud in a macrophylla hydrangea. Now, there's been a lot of breeding efforts on these hydrangeas, a lot. I'd say there have been more breeding efforts in macrophylla hydrangeas over the last 15 or 20 years than maybe any other group of shrub anyway. There's always breeding efforts going on annuals and roses and all sorts of other perennials, things like that. But I would say if you just take the category of shrubs, I would say that probably more breeding efforts in macrophylla hydrangea than anything else. And what they've been trying to do is develop or breed with varieties that show what we call remontancy, which is the ability for these plants to bloom on that new wood. And they've come a long way for sure. Some of the varieties that are out there are considered remontant, meaning that they can bloom on new wood or old wood, or they rebloom. That's another another name for that. So if we look at this one right here, this is a variety called Bloomstruck, and this comes out of the program, the Endless Summer breeding program. So Endless Summer was bred and developed up in the Twin Cities. As far as I know, Endless Summer, the original one, is the best-selling hydrangea on the market. Specifically out on the coast, just an absolutely amazing plant. I did a landscape project on the coast of New Jersey many years ago and installed some Endless Summer hydrangeas. Went back a few years later, and those Endless Summer hydrangeas are about almost my height, about 6 feet tall, 5 to 6 feet tall, 5 to 6 feet wide, and they probably get 1,000 plus flowers at a time. They're absolutely incredible. So it's just a reblooming machine, but that's out on the coast. Here in northern Illinois, I call Endless Summer the Endless Bummer, because the plant always looks amazing. I always have a big, beautiful green plant, and it rarely ever flowers. So they've refined the Endless Summer and have done more breeding efforts with it. They've developed a bunch of others. Bloomstruck is one of them. I think Bloomstruck is actually a very good, if you're going to try a macrophylla hydrangea, I think it's a good one. So these here, this is actually, these are buds. So those are kind of that remontant bloom that I was talking about. So these are new flowers coming off of this year's growth, new wood, whereas some of these other ones were probably coming off of last year's growth. So some of these early flowers came from old wood, and yet as these are fading, it's still reblooming or starting new bloom. So these are going to be, big puffball type hydrangeas here in a little while. When the flowers are big and round like this, we call these mop head hydrangeas. I'll show you in a moment another type of hydrangea that's got kind of more of a flat flower, and we call those lace cap hydrangeas. So in terms of the flower type, so if you hear those two things, now you're going to know the difference between mop head and lace cap. So what do you do with these for care? That's probably the biggest question I get. These love extra winter protection. As I mentioned, the winters are very tough here. So do not trim these at all in the fall. That's my first recommendation. Do not trim them at all. Leave the stems completely intact. The stem, just like our skin, is our first line of defense if we go out in the winter time, right? The stems of the plant being whole and not being cut where there's an open end on it is going to allow for moisture to stay in that plant better. As I mentioned, that winter damage, or what we call desiccation, is the process of this stem basically drying out completely, or the buds drying out completely. So it's basically like freeze-dried, for lack of a better term. So we want to avoid desiccation. The first thing that you can do is keep the stems completely intact. The next thing that you can do is you can bury the lower portion of the plant with an extra layer of mulch, something coarse, like a leaf mulch or a wood chip mulch, something like that, to bury the crown of the plant. So right down at the bottom, fill that up, kind of really bury it good. Maybe 4 to 6 inches of coarse mulch would be great. That'll insulate the soil, insulate the roots and the lower portions of the stems some. The last thing that you can do, which is quite effective, is you can take chicken wire or fencing or burlap and create basically a cylinder around the plant. And then you can fill that cylinder with leaves. So it's basically like putting a winter coat on the plant for the winter months. So just you might need like a couple of bamboo stakes or a couple thin fence posts or something like that. Wrap the burlap or the chicken wire around it, so you've basically made a little cage, and then fill that up with leaves. What that's going to do is it's going to give it a winter coat, so when the drying winter winds are beating against the cage, they're hitting the cage and the leaves and all of that, and they're not pounding basically the stems and that tissue there, allowing it to preserve some of that moisture that's in there and hopefully insulating it from the real extreme temperatures, the 20, 30 below kind of stuff that we get here sometimes. So those are my tips for caring for these. The other thing about these is that they are very pH sensitive. So soil pH, anything above 7 would be considered alkaline. Anything below that is going to be considered acidic. These would actually like it down in the 5, 5.5 range. They can do okay above that, but you'll see different flower colors. So with this particular one here, Bloomstruck, in the higher pH soils, you're going to see more purpley pink colors. If you get, or even like a pinkish red. If you get down into the very low pH areas, 5, 5.5, you're going to see more blue out of it. So if you're looking for those like really bright blue type colors, you'll want to acidify your soil using something like aluminum sulfate, or we have a product that's just generically called soil acidifier. There's a product out there on the market called Color Me Blue. Any of those kind of products are going to work, and they're going to drive the soil pH down. Around here, our natural soil pH is between 7.2 and 7.6. So you're going to have a pink hydrangea unless you treat the soil to lower the pH. Okay, so that's macrophylla hydrangea. Closely related is a hydrangea called a mountain hydrangea or Hydrangea serrata. And I brought this one up here because they are just a touch hardier than the macrophylla hydrangea, but they are basically finicky like the macrophylla, so I kind of almost group them together. In fact, for a long time, they were thought to be one group, and then they separated serrata from macrophylla. But I brought this one up because it's a lace cap hydrangea. It doesn't have any huge flowers on it right now, but you can kind of see this flower. So it's more of a flat type flower, and it's got these big pink petals out here. So again, in higher pH soils, this is going to be pink. In lower pH soils, it's going to be more of a blue or purple color. And what you're seeing here, this is called a showy flower or an attractor flower. So this thing right here actually has no pollen on it, no, in terms of plant, it has no sex parts on it. It's literally just something like, hey, it's drawing attention to the pollinating insects, like, hey, come check me out. But there's no pollen, there's nothing on here. The actual flower, the fertile flower, is right down in here, which is not very showy, although it actually looks kind of cool in my opinion. But in terms of like attracting insects, it's not something big and showy like this. They're tiny little flowers, groups of tiny little flowers on the inside here. That's where the pollen is. So those are the sex parts of the plant. And in the case of these hydrangeas, these flowers eventually, when they're established and in the ground, will get nice and large. They'll be about this big, and you'll have a ring of those showy attractor flowers around the outside, and you're going to have all those fertile flowers on the inside. So that's what a lace cap hydrangea would look like. This particular one is called Tough Stuff Red. There's a whole series of Tough Stuff. This comes from Proven Winners. There's Tough Stuff, Tiny Tough Stuff, Tough Stuff Red, Tough Stuff Aha. They're really good hydrangeas. I like these. I do think they're a touch hardier than the macrophylla hydrangeas. So if you're looking for a touch hardier, they're a little more compact. The leaves tend to be just a touch smaller. I would basically treat them the same as a macrophylla hydrangea in terms of its care. So I wouldn't do any trimming on it in the fall. I'd do some extra mulching. I would try the leaf cage, all that kind of stuff. So that's the mountain hydrangea.